Joining us now to discuss India and climate change, Suresh Prabhu. He is that country's former Minister of the Environment. And we welcome you here to the province of Ontario and to Canada. It's nice to meet you.
My pleasure.
Well, climate change is a huge issue here in Canada. And I think we want you in here tonight to get a better sense of how important this issue is to a country with 1 billion people in it. So tell us, for India, is it a big deal?
Yeah, actually, now we are not just 1 billion, but 1.17 billion people.
I didn't mean to shortchange you. I'm sorry.
Okay. And these numbers are just illustrative of the fact that half of them are really poor, and most of them do not have electricity, the poor people. And therefore, the challenge of India now is to cope with climate change in a way that we do not compromise with the growing aspirations of these people. India is already facing huge problem because of water shortage, which is coming because of climatic changes that are taking place. We are facing huge problem because there is a drought in some part of the country. There are floods in other part of the country, again because of climate change. Then our energy mix, which we have to change now because we can't afford to burn coal as much as we are doing now. So we need new technologies that to come in. And so India is really facing a huge problem. In fact, this challenge is worse compounded by the fact that India's priorities is also removal of poverty, which is in fact not just India's priority but also global challenge, because in Millennium Development Goals we talk about reducing poverty by half by 2015, and most of the poor in the world live in India. So if you want to reduce poverty of the world, you must do it in India.
But I'm guessing if you are poor and you don't have electricity and you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, you don't care that much about climate change. Is that fair to say?
That's what, actually, it may look like that, but not in reality, because, for example, the poorest of the poor are suffering because they realize that their situation has become worse because of climate change, because the heat level is going up, the sea level rise is already taking place in some part, and India has a huge coastline on the east and west coast of India, like in Canada. And therefore, we have a coastline, so coastal people are getting affected. The people living on the banks of the river, and they are again in millions, they are getting affected because water flows are getting changed.
But do they understand the reasons behind why that's happening?
He may not understand in terms of the scientific language. He may not understand the word mitigation and adaptation, but he still understands that he has to adapt to this reality in which now he's getting not enough water, he's not getting that type of heat, he has to cope with it. That means he has to actually, the crops, 63% of India's population is dependent on agriculture. And when the heat level is going up, that means the cropping pattern has to change.
So what has the Indian government done, in your view, to move the yardsticks forward and make some progress against climate change?
One, of course, we have done a lot of local action. We have a huge climate change adaptation plan, climate change action plan, in addition to adaptation plan, in which we are trying to get in 8 different missions. We are trying to change energy mix by getting solar energy. We are trying to get energy efficiency, which will really bring in a lot of improvement, maybe 5 percentage point in the next several years. Then we are also working on changing the cropping pattern in one way. So we are doing many things, but that's local action. But climate change is a global phenomena.
Yeah.
Even if you try to do everything locally, it's not going to help, because why the climate is changing is not just because what happens in India. It is changing because something which is happening maybe thousands of kilometers away in US.
But with 1,117 million, or whatever that number was, you can have a huge impact on it. You would agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And therefore, I always believe that the ecosystem of the world is like one human body. Your hand is not separated from your leg. Everything is connected to one another. So the ecosystem of the world, if something is happening in the United States or something is happening in Europe, it is affecting India. That means we have to have a global action, a global solution.
Absolutely, absolutely fair point. However, when you hear people in the West say, why should we bother to try to make progress on climate change when they're building a new coal-fired plant in China every week, and there are 1.17 billion Indians who are also contributing far more to this problem than they are in helping solve it?
Yeah, actually, this is a good argument for not doing something which you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. I can always say that because my neighbor is doing this, I don't want to, there's no reason why you should not do it when you are required to do it. Because first of all, the West, the industrialized nations are under international obligations to do this, because they themselves signed a protocol in Kyoto, and before that, United Framework Convention on Climate Change. But when both these documents were signed, we didn't know at that time that climate change is happening for sure, because scientific evidence was still lacking, which now we have got because of the IPCC, which now says that climate is changing for sure. And not only it is changing because of some action naturally taking place, but it is changing because of human action.
Yes.
When the human action started, it started with industrial revolution. Who are the countries who participated in industrial revolution? Are the countries which are industrialized nations. So therefore, there is a reason why they should act. And this climate change, these greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, is because of that action.
Now understand, so when Indians hear people in the West complain about the contribution they don't believe Indians are adequately making, there's an expression in English, do they get their nose out of joint about it? Are they upset about it?
I'll tell you, to put this issue into perspective, we have got only global, if you go by global emission, India is already 17% of global population, and India's share is not even 4%. In fact, India's per capita emission is 1/20th of that of United States or Canada. So you can imagine that how much is Indians are really emitting and how much is India is contributing towards this. While it is so that it is not contributing to greenhouse gases, if you terms of suffering the ill effects of climate change, disproportionately high results are taking place in India. And therefore, India is actually it's a double whammy. We are not contributed to it, but we are suffering from it. Again, to cope with this, 6% of India's GDP has to be earmarked for adaptation to climate change. And you can imagine India is, of course, growing very well and already more than $1 trillion economy. But still, if you want to now divert 6% of your GDP
That's a big
for
number.
adaptation, how can you actually ensure a good education for people? How can you afford to give healthcare for people? How can you make investments into infrastructure?
Well, tell me this. You were the Minister of the Environment.
That's right.
When the Minister of the Environment says, I need this in order to clean up our carbon dioxide emissions, is he listened to in India?
That's a problem because normally what happens is Ministry of Environment is always considered as a stumbling block for development. Now it's a time that we, not just in India but globally, must define what we mean by development. The development doesn't mean just skyscrapers. Development doesn't mean only roads. Development doesn't mean that we have to get rid of whatever we had as part of a culture. That's not development. We have to need development which can ensure that that process of development is sustainable for life. Not just life of you and me, but lives of the planet. And if that is what is development, then it cannot be the responsibility of one ministry alone, that's the Environment Ministry. And then if you look at it like that, then Ministry of Environment would not be seen as a stumbling block, but probably as a guiding figure to ensure that, like a religious leader who gives you a service, he actually tells you what is right for you.
Well, let me ask you about the current guiding figure, because the current Minister of the Environment is, quote, drafting legislation that would set its own targets for mitigating carbon emissions through various domestic initiatives. That's what he said. However, the leader of the BJP has said the following: any departure from the earlier stance will be disastrous for India. Our position has been that India will not accept any legally binding caps, and that measures India would take would be in consonance with our growth and development plans. A confident nation should not be scared of protecting its national interests. What's your response to that?
Let me explain this issue to you. Basically, India is doing a lot more on our own without any international commitment to do so. But you must understand that India's priorities, for example, if we take, for example, just imagine for argument's sake that India is now bound by international commitment to reduce emissions. Reduce from what? Reduce from 1.1 ton per person. If you want to reduce below this, what would happen to those who have no electricity? Would they accept it? Would it be a sustainable socially? Will it be politically viable for any democratic country to say that half of the population will live without electricity, the remaining half will have electricity? Is it something which is doable? Or is it something which even the rest of the world should ask India to do, when realizing the fact that it's an equity issue? What are we talking about? We are saying that we need an equitable world in which there are countries which are very fortunate enough to have developed better. Now it's a responsibility of those countries to ensure that the development of other nations happens in a manner that does not commit the same mistakes which they have committed.
So should the West pay India to reduce its emissions?
I must say it's fair because this is part of the agreement, as also in the UNFCCC we have already agreed that compensation has to be paid, because globally we accepted a principle, a jurisprudence, that polluter must pay. If polluter has to pay, then obviously you can identify the damage that is caused to the environment, and it is proved by the scientists of almost more than 140 countries who meet together to decide what are the causes of climate change. And they have said this has happened because of industrialized nations' own contribution.
Okay, but you know the argument the West makes. The West makes the argument that, yes, when we were developing our economies, we did not have at that time 21st century green technology that we have today.
Sure.
You do have access to that technology,
Absolutely.
therefore you must avail yourselves of it.
So we want to use them. So we, in fact, are saying the same thing that the West is saying. Let's not waste our energies into doing something which West did in the past. So what we should do? We should try to use the technology which are available to us. In fact, almost 45% of the problem can be solved by using only those technologies which are proved and proven technologies. Now, why not use those technologies? Then somebody will come and say, these are to be controlled by intellectual property rights. Now, what is the intellectual property right in relation to saving the planet? Because what is intellect? The intelligence is the intellect. Where does it lie? It lies in human body somewhere. But if the human bodies themselves are not going to live on this planet, what is the meaning of that intellectual property right? Is it not the right? More than the right, what is wrong is important. So what we should try to do is to correct the wrong by getting right technologies to be used by everybody.
Well, let me follow up on that. Here, the McKinsey company wrote something called An Approach for India. And here's a quote from it. By 2030, they say, India is likely to have a GDP of 4 trillion US dollars and a population of 1.5 billion. This will swell demand for critical resources such as coal and oil, with a parallel increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Considering that 80% of the India of 2030 is yet to be built, the country may have a unique opportunity to pursue development while managing emissions growth, enhancing its energy security and creating a few world-scale clean technology industries. Do you think it's realistic for India to become a green technology leader in the future?
We want to do that. In fact, I will give just one number. India wants to construct 50,000 megawatts of solar power plant by 2050. Now, where are we getting this? We are actually constructing this because we don't have the technology.
You have to buy it from someone.
So we are buying it. So what are we doing? In the process of cleaning our energy sector, we are helping the rest of the world to sell the technologies. So in fact, this is one contribution India is making to them.
Are you buying any from us by chance?
No, we are buying from various quarters. I don't know who will be buying from. But you know, what I'm saying is, can there not be a collaborative effort rather than pointing fingers? I've always believed that rather than fighting each other, can we not fight together the menace of climate change? Rather than developed countries and developing nations fight like this, can we not say, let us have a collaborative effort?
Let me follow up on that, because we're looking forward to Copenhagen right now, right?
Yeah.
The United Nations Climate Change Conference in
That's
Copenhagen will take place in December. That is supposed to try to replace the Kyoto Protocol, which was passed but never implemented by a number of large countries. What position is India going to take in Copenhagen at that meeting?
You know, we definitely want a deal in Copenhagen because we feel that Kyoto is going to expire in 2012 and we need a successor to Kyoto Protocol because, you know, there's no longer a luxury of negotiations and discussion, but a real need, an imperative demand of this humanity that we must have a deal in Copenhagen. So we want a deal in Copenhagen. We feel that those countries who have taken commitments in the past must fulfill those commitments. If they have not done that and then still asking others to now take new commitments, it is actually passing the buck. So we don't want that to happen.
India was not part of Kyoto, right?
No, it never.
So it was not intended to be, right?
That's right.
You want to be part of the new agreement, is that right?
Yeah, but we were part of the previous agreement as well. But we are not under obligation to reduce emissions because
hit the emission
it was
targets,
only the
that's
industrialized nations which are supposed to reduce it. India, in fact, without being required to reduce emissions under any protocol, is trying to do a lot more. We are trying to increase our energy efficiency. We are trying to bring in more solar energy. India is the 5th largest producer of wind power in the world. One of the Indian companies called Suzlon is actually providing wind turbines to the rest of the world and helping not only India to solve her problem, but also helping rest of the world to solve their problem. So this is what is a contribution we are trying to make. But still, we are willing to do a lot more if there is a collaboration. Collaboration in terms of research and development for developing new technologies, cutting-edge technologies, which we can pursue and will not repeat the same mistakes of the past. Secondly, adaptation, as I said, is a huge amount of money that is required for that and it's a drain on India's resources. So can we not find some money, which we have agreed already, under the protocol and use that money for adapting to new realities of climate change. So India wants a Copenhagen deal. It's absolutely necessary, and India is in fact not only speaking for herself, but also speaking for the whole developing world, because we realize the developing world, the poor of the world, not only in developing countries, but also in developed nations, they are the ones who are suffering from climate change.
You know what? You lost the last election, didn't you?
That's right.
You speak about this with such passion and interest. I got to believe you're going to run again. You want to get back in and tackle this, don't you?
I want to, definitely, because this is a great opportunity to serve your people. I've been a chartered accountant, a banker, a lawyer. I've done many things in one life.
Educator.
Yeah. But I realized that there is no instrument like politics which can actually help you to solve the problems of India. For example, I made a new law called Electricity Act in India. I made the energy conservation law in India. I made so many environmental legislations in India, which are now become a landmark for bringing about a change. So I couldn't have done all this if I was not in the parliament. I couldn't have done all this if I was not in the government. So of course, I have to run with the time. But again, I'm worried by the fact, if you really ask me, what's the biggest challenge the humanity has ever faced? That's climate change. So I genuinely feel it's not a question of I against you. It's a question of you and me together. Can we save the planet?
Mr. Prabhu, it's a great pleasure to meet you. Thanks so much for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Thank you.